Okay, I think we're going to get going. It's 3 after here, after 11:30 Pacific, and I wanted to welcome everybody to our webinar called Avoiding the Domino Effect, Evaluating the Physical Conditions of Aging Permanent Supportive Housing Sites in Los Angeles. I'm Mark Tusignant. I direct our supportive housing work for the Enterprise Southern California office. And for those of you that may not be familiar with Enterprise as an organization, we're a national nonprofit. We're like an intermediary for financial and technical support for the affordable housing sector. And today's webinar kind of follows some programmatic focus for us locally on preserving aging supportive housing. And so in a little bit, I'll get into some background on how we got here to today and some of the research that we're looking to feature today. For those of you that are joining us and want to ask questions, we're leaving some time at the end for that. So please use the Q&A feature for that, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can towards the end. We've left at least 15 minutes towards the end. Okay, next slide. So I want to just quickly walk through the agenda with you today. We'll start with some initial acknowledgments of some of our project partners, as well as our funders that supported the research. I'll give a little bit of background on our preservation work of supportive housing in the Southern California market. A little context on how we got to the point where we decided to focus a little bit more specifically on studying the physical needs of aging supportive housing. And then I will turn it over to Rod Lane, who's our main project partner. He's a consultant with and principal with LCS Consulting Services. He was our lead researcher and partner on this research project. He'll talk about some of the findings from the research, including how we approached it in terms of methodology, some of the key findings, and then we'll both kind of explore how what we took away from the research in terms of recommendations and some next steps following the study. We'll leave some time for some Q&A for you. We definitely want to get to some of your questions, so don't be shy. And then we will close at approximately 1 p.m. Pacific, which we may not actually need the full 90 minutes, but we want to budget that in case we needed the full amount of time. Okay, next slide. So we want to just quickly call out some of our key partners for this work. And I've obviously already called out Rod. Rod's our main project partner on this research. He's with LCS Consulting Services. I know when we turn it over to him, he'll give you a little bit of background on his work with respect to supportive housing. We're very delighted to have him as our primary partner and certainly carrying the weight of conducting a lot of the physical needs assessments on these sites that we're studying, as well as the preparation of the summary report. We also couldn't do this work without a lot of our nonprofit organizations that we consider to be our anchors and key partners in this work. 5 organizations actually contributed properties within their portfolio for basically studying. And so we did physical needs assessments on those sites. So we appreciate their work. They're also part of our bigger preservation work in general. And they're part of a work group that we call the LAPSH Preservation Work Group. So those groups are Abode Communities, Community of Friends, Hollywood Community Housing Corporation, LA Family Housing, and SRO Housing Corporation. So you guys are on the front line of this work, providing supportive housing. We really appreciate the fact that you were able to participate with us on this study. And then we certainly couldn't do this work without our funding support and our partners in the philanthropic space. So we wanted to acknowledge Cedars-Sinai and the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. Hilton Foundation has been with us for several years now, supporting this preservation work. But we're particularly indebted to Cedars-Sinai for wanting to take the leap and really wanting to dig in more specifically on studying these physical conditions in these sites. And so that was an opportunity to get some specific funding to do this examination and this study. And we were really, really pleased to be partnering with Emily Skehan with Cedars-Sinai. I just wanted to give Emily maybe a quick minute, if she could, just to sort of, offer some remarks and some context on the work.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mark. First of all, just thrilled how many people are interested in permanent supportive housing preservation. So thank you all so much for joining us this morning. And deeply indebted to Rod and the whole team at Enterprise and all of the housing providers who participated in this work. We reached out to Enterprise really in the wake of the Skid Row Housing Trust collapse, because we saw how we had, a really meaningful stock of property that was providing housing for our neighbors here in Los Angeles that had fallen into such disrepair that some of it became functionally uninhabitable. And we just had the question of, if we wanted to be proactive about this so that we didn't see additional housing providers facing this level of deterioration, what would it take? And so we reached out to Enterprise and said, we have this vague concept. Do you think you can do anything with it? And so deeply grateful that they really dove in and thought very intricately and technically around how to answer that question. And so I won't spoil any punchlines, but what I will say is that this is really meaningful research. And my takeaway is that to keep properties that have been providing housing for our neighbors who need it for, in some cases, 30 years, to keep them operating for another 30 years doesn't take as much as I thought it would. And so I think this report and hopefully what you walk away with today will show that preservation can really be thought of as prevention, especially at a moment where there's so much uncertainty around incoming investments from the federal government. The state budget is tough. The local budget is tough. Preserving the housing stock that we already have, I think, is going to become increasingly critical. And they've really mapped out how to do that in a thoughtful way such that we can continue to have really great housing stay available for another 20 or 30 years. So with that, I'll turn it back over, but really grateful that you're all here today and excited to dive into this information with you.
Thank you so much, Emily. And again, to Cedars-Sinai for investing in this important research. We couldn't do it without you. So next slide, please. So now I'll just give a little bit of background on some of the preservation work that we've been doing, because I think it sets the context for how we decided to take a deeper plunge into this physical needs aspect of the sort of preservation issue, if you will, with supportive housing. And so next slide, please. So I just want to kind of give you a quick overview of kind of some of the barriers that a lot of our nonprofit PSH owners are facing as they're looking to sort of stabilize, sustain, and preserve these properties for the long term. They kind of fall into three general areas of obstacles, I would say, or considerations. And those are physical, financial, and sort of public policy related. Just a quick, broader global note to say that we are very much, and you can imagine certainly as a financial intermediary, very supportive of the work to produce and create additional supportive housing supply. Obviously, that's critical in our fight to end homelessness in our communities. We can't do it. We know there's a huge gap relative to the demand that's out there among those experiencing homelessness for that model. But we also believe that preserving and modernizing our existing supportive housing stock, that a lot of that was set in motion decades ago, is also an integral component to the regional homelessness response. We need these properties, we need these communities, we need these residents, we need these sponsors to be stable and thriving for the long term so we can continue to offer that important intervention over the horizon. So I'll just go into each of these three real quickly. So on the physical side, what we're really up against is buildings that are aging and really accumulating a fair amount of deferred maintenance needs. And in the context of that, what I think we're seeing is a general need to revisit even building systems and upgrade them because of the sheer age of these properties. And that's been difficult to do, just given some of the economics of some of these properties and so on and so forth. But that is a main motivation for preservation. We really need to improve the physical environment. And through the course of doing that modernization, we can also tackle other related goals and outcomes that I think are widely important for the field and certainly for all of us and the residents, which is improving the accessibility footprint for the property, improving the energy efficiency of the property, and also looking at addressing seismic risk if that matters. Again, the long-term goal is to really ensure the building's sustainable over the long term, and that we can meet the demands of what we call, considered to be modern day sort of supportive housing. And sometimes what that means is, in some cases, that may mean adjusting and adapting the physical layout of the building to be able to accommodate more space and room for on-site services. Think about a lot of these older buildings are single room occupancy buildings. They're limited in terms of their unit amenities, their common space amenities. So there is also an aspect of this work which is trying to adapt the building to be able to better accommodate on-site services, individual office space, group activities, things like that. On the financial side, I think one of the main risk factors has just been the sheer sort of economics of these buildings, where the cost to operate the building and basically the way that they were structured and underwritten decades ago has just not has obviously far outpaced the amount of income that's coming in through either subsidy or tenant rents or so forth. So that continues to be a major threat because the costs are definitely exceeding the revenue. And that certainly was exacerbated during the pandemic, when you thought about some of those protections around rents and things like that, and non-payment sort of rent and things like that. And that really has created a major, major concern for owners that are looking now to stabilize these properties and catch up to basically where they were even pre-pandemic. There are properties that don't have some operating subsidies, and that is obviously a concern. For those that do, and most of them do that we've studied, even the subsidies that they do have are not necessarily set up in a way that's really kept pace with the operating costs. A lot of these are old HUD continuum of care funds or SRO mod rehab grants, and just the way that they're structured is not really conducive, I think, to meet sort of modern day economics for these properties. So that continues to be a concern. As a result of just the general cash flow position for properties, we've seen just limited or depleted project reserves. So what typically owners would be able to tap into to address some of these physical needs, deferred maintenance needs, the resources just aren't there based on the limited thin margins, if any, that these properties have financially. So what that results is, for those properties that do have deficits, that really means that owners have to contribute their own resources to sort of offset those deficits, and that puts those agencies in a very difficult financial position. On the public policy side, there's really two main factors I would call out. One is the sheer fact that the public finance programs that are out there to support, the development costs for preservation are really just limited for preservation candidates. There's a lot of reasons for that. I won't get into all of those today, but generally these properties are either not eligible or not competitive. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of these programs are focused on production, right? They're focused on creating new supply. They're not focused necessarily on projects that really just need rehab assistance only. And then the other consideration is, I think over time, and this has been in the last 10 years or so, the adaptation to the use of coordinated entry and the inherent focus on that system on targeting the most acute households for placement into PSH has put a strain on the capacity and the resources for a lot of these organizations that have older buildings that were just simply not budgeted or staffed or structured to really accommodate that population. And so that is particularly challenged for older deals than it is even for newer deals, although I think all of the field is struggling with this adaptation. So that is another thing to be mindful of. Okay, so next slide. And I'll just kind of close with this slide, which is basically some context on our local work. And we've really been keen in studying and interested in focusing on the preservation of aging supportive housing, because a lot of our nonprofit partners, those are the portfolios that they have. They were in the business of doing supportive housing in the early days, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they're at a point now where they really, really are challenged to sort of like figure out how to preserve these deals long term. So that's why we jumped in to try to provide some leadership. We are basically every 2 years, we're going around to these owners and tracking the status of properties that are considered at risk. At risk meaning that the property is at least 15 years old, it's facing some form of near-term covenant risk, affordability risk, and/or there's some sort of financial or physical viability threat that needs to be resolved in the next 5 years for the project to be viable. And so over time, we're actually updating this as we speak for 2025, But in 2022, we published our last version of that risk assessment and identified about 57 projects in a little over 2,600 units. The age of these buildings is really pretty staggering, and obviously that speaks to why these physical needs are so profound that we'll talk about today. The median year was 1925. So a lot of these are early 20th century buildings, SROs predominate. And you can just imagine just how old these buildings are and these building systems are and the layouts. We also ask owners to provide an estimate of what they think it would cost to rehab the property. And in the aggregate, it's just shy of 150 million. Now we're going to update that this year and see where that gets adjusted to. But just think about that in relation to the cost of like creating a new supportive housing building these days. I know that may depend on where you are. We have folks in different regions on this call, but that could be between 3, 4 to 5 new projects just alone. So I think that is very telling for the amount of impact that we can get for not that much in terms of resources to be able to preserve a wide swath of at-risk aging PSH. And then finally, just again to reiterate kind of this sort of financial health aspect, because it is such a key risk factor for these projects and these owners, basically 8 in 10 projects that we've studied are operating at break-even operations or running deficits. And then the majority are actually at deficit. So that is just not something year after year that these owners can sustain. And that is tremendously imperiling, I think, not only the project's viability and health, but the health of the organization overall. And so we've got owners that are contributing significant resources annually to keep these properties going. So that's generally what we're trying to tackle here. And the brief that we're just sort of the cover page there, that's available on our website. It is absolutely there to sort of walk through the characteristics and the risk profile of these properties that we've been studying. And then we leave, the brief with a series of recommendations and solutions, because this is stuff that we can tackle. We just have to prioritize it. So anyway, so that's kind of how we got to the work around supportive housing preservation. We had this unique opportunity through the funds that we had to go a little bit deeper than what we do in this risk assessment and look specifically at the physical conditions, which is not something that this risk assessment really gets deeply into, per project. But that was the opportunity that we had in front of us last year. And that's why we decided to partner with Rod Lane and his firm, because we couldn't think of a better firm in terms of being qualified to do these kinds of assessments, to really look across the portfolios, draw some, key findings and conclusions, and help us inform what it looks like to sort of resolve some of these physical needs in the immediate standpoint. So that's kind of the context for today's presentation. And what I will say is, before we get going, I know we've got a couple polls that we want to do. And I apologize, Christina, because I think I jumped through our first 2 polls. But I think what we want to do is just get a quick sense of who's in the room. So if we could pull up our first poll, which is, okay, so this is a different poll. We know a lot of owners out there are in the room, and organizations that operate supportive housing. So we just want to know what type of organization that you represent, just to give us a sense of who we're talking to today. So I'm seeing a fair amount of housing developers, state and local government. Okay. We've got some others too. I know we couldn't categorize everybody there. Feel free to put who you are in terms of that other category in the chat if you want. But that's helpful. That's a pretty good spread between state and local government developers and others. And thank you, advocates and funders too. We certainly appreciate you. Okay, I think we can close that. And let's move to our second poll, which is trying to get a sense of what type of staff and role that you have within the organization. If we could pull that up. So we've got asset management, executive director, CEO, property management, maintenance, real estate development. Okay. That's great. That's great. I know a lot of our work targets the asset management sort of discipline. So that's great to see you guys on this call as well. Love to see these executive directors in the room. And obviously there's a big chunk of others out there. See who's coming in. Okay. Okay, great. think we can end that. And then let's jump to our final poll, which is for you owners out there in the room that are carrying a supportive housing portfolio, may or may not be aging or at risk. But what percentage of your portfolio do you have concerns about? 25% or less, 25 to 50%, or 50% or more? Okay. Well, just seeing that 50% plus figure is pretty telling for me, because I think that's what we're trying to speak to today. Is there are a lot of organizations out there that are in this situation where they really need help, and they need resources, and they need attention on this aging portfolio. That's helpful. Okay. So almost 50% with 50% or less, but that's still substantive. So appreciate you guys taking time just to kind of give us a little bit more intel. Okay, so at this point, I think we close that. And we are going to thank you so much, Christina, Christina Ta, my team, who's been such a helpful ally on this webinar and this work in general. We're going to close that out, and then we're going to turn it over to Rod, who is going to walk us through the findings. And so, Rod, it is all yours, and I'm just delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I'm really actually, it's been a lot of work, but I'm quite honored to have been selected to do this work. It kind of comes at a time that I'm looking at about. I started in doing construction management and affordable housing in 1997. And was later asked by somebody from a community of friends to do a physical needs assessment. And I said, what's that? And what I thought when I learned what it was is, oh, well, that'd be something that I can kind of like just do on the side to be a better construction manager and learn how buildings age. Over time, it's become the main thing that we do. And I would next slide, if you would, to give an idea of where I speak as we go through our findings. So we've been doing needs assessments for over 20 years, and we've done, hundreds have been permanent supportive housing. We've actually assisted in the work of the needed capital improvements, and we found that most of them, while Mark mentioned 1925 as an original year of construction, most of them have been rehabbed. Some of them are new, and that's taken place, most of what we've looked at, from 1990 to 2010. Many of the properties we visited several times for various reasons, different applications, and we saw how they aged. Unfortunately, too often we saw the same problems just existing for the lack of funding, being able to solve the problems and take the recommendations that we had given, and some of them were apparent even before that. Some of them just became more and more severe. And what we did see is that of course there's insufficient resources in order to accomplish the recommendations that we had been making. Next slide, please. So with that, we have been in looking at that, we go into units and talk to people. Actually, we didn't intend to talk to them. They mostly talked to us because our job was to just look at the building. And we got to know what this population is, and we were in their homes. We had an opportunity to be there more than most owners because we got to go to every single unit in some cases, or a large sampling. And of course, this population is often, not always, but hard to deal with, and they tend to be harder on the properties, and they tend to either underreport or overreport issues, and there's a big need to be able to look at the units, look at the building, and assess them on a regular basis, as we'll talk about more. The the condition of the building is particularly important to this population. They spend more time in their units than others may, who are working or going to school or doing other types of things. And it's really important that they have an environment that they feel well taken care of. I think that part of the supportiveness of supportive housing is for people to feel heard, to feel cared about, to feel recognized. And that's often done so often. I've gone through units or buildings where the person who seemed to know the most about the personal lives of people in the building was the maintenance person, because they had a reason to go inside the units that was acceptable to everyone, and they often were had a close relationship. The owners, of course, have an obstacle to doing that with the regulations that keep them from, so-called intruding on people in their units. Next slide, please. So these are just some things that directly, not necessarily the building, but the things that we thought really affect the quality of life the most directly. And things like doors that people don't necessarily think about. The door closers, if they don't work well, or they're too hard to open, or they don't have like a peephole, affect how they feel and the security that they have, the ability of their, to feel comfortable. That's the entrance. The flooring, the window coverings, if they don't operate well, often people are leaving them closed, or they don't have their privacy, and it impacts how they feel. The paint and the countertops, the other things that are listed here, all affect their sense of safety and comfort. And again, everyone is sensitive to these issues, but all the more so among this population, we find. Next slide, please. So what has happened? Why do we have the kinds of conditions that we're observing? Why do we have the Skid Row Housing Trust situation? And how does it take place? Of course, the biggest cost is the funding, but the process of the decline of buildings is gradual, and it takes place over time. And each step, as is shown here, deferred maintenance increases, and then the conditions decline, and the cost of repairs go up. And this leads to what may have been repairs becomes a replacement. And this creates more financial pressure on the property and the organization and the management. Income goes down and vacancy goes up as things may not be able to be repaired immediately or sufficiently. There's rent abatement that pushes more financial pressure on these properties. And from that financial stress, and as that increases, less can be done. And people start to feel like they're not cared about. And I think that we see that in buildings where people feel cared about and others care about the building, they tend to care about the building more. And so abuse and then vandalism is the broken window syndrome of people just feeling like something is deteriorating. And then this downward cycle just accelerates, and less deferred maintenance and back down this cascade of problems. Next slide, please. So we looked at this inventory that was presented to us by the Enterprise Foundation and by Mark. And it was taken from 50 at-risk properties. We selected 20 of the properties to get a sampling. And the biggest thing that we found is that, and we'll talk again, and we'll talk about that more and sure give the evidence, but was the insufficient availability of reserves and adequate maintenance resources. There's a need for these properties to be assessed because people are often, organizations are often surprised by the outcomes of assessments. And so we took on this study to assess these 20 properties and give a detailed analysis of where they were. The goal of this at the end of the day is to change that downward spiral and to get and advocate for the resources that are needed. As Mark mentioned, the resources, while they are substantial, they are a fraction of what is needed, what it costs to build new housing, a small fraction, actually, even at their largest. And so there's a great value in investing in this, and the realization, particularly, this is in the California area, where housing is a bit newer and where multifamily housing has not aged in the same way, say, for some of you from back east, where they call maintenance people building engineers, and out here it seems to be of a lesser status. We've seen where asset management in organizations and property maintenance seem to be the stepsister of the organization. And we've seen, fortunately, not enough, but we've seen a growth in the professionalism and the resources that are allocated to that. Next slide. So we looked at, so the method we used is to look at these 20 at-risk properties and take various types. Some of them were previously unreinforced masonry buildings. Some of them had been constructed from ground up, and some of them were old, even we have come across some that have been converted buildings from other sources. In doing so and looking at the condition, we kept the anonymity of the buildings and the organizations and took that information and aggregated it to see what was happening overall and to be able to present those findings. We did debrief each of the organizations on what we found, but kept the exact results of each building anonymous. Next slide. So we went through that process, and for each property, we spent about half a day at each one. We took hundreds of photos, and we scored across 30 different elements. This was not a full physical needs assessment, as might be done for resyndication and for TCAC or for other funding sources. But we looked at the items that could possibly tip the scale, whether that scale be a downward deterioration of the building or something that would make it less adequate for those who live there and reduce their quality of life. So we particularly tied things to the cost efficiency, the safety, longevity, and residents' well-being. Next slide. So to give you a quick, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly just to give you a sense. This is just really an excerpt. Next slide. From PNA. We've come up with what we call, actually, we're calling these essential needs assessments. And because of this study and what we found, we realized that there's a need to really be able to visualize and understand what's going on with a building. The things that are of lighter colors are going from green to red are those items that are most effective, most deteriorated or on the negative side. And we'll talk about, again, we'll go into the research study. Next slide. So we have a list of things that we went through. Next slide. So we study things, anything from low voltage. Of course, security systems are important because of the neighborhoods these are in. The elevator issue is critical because I think some of the Skid Row Housing Trust buildings, one of their major problems was the inability to support and the elevator repair, and had elevators that are out of building. That's a recurring problem at many buildings. Next slide. So of course, roofs, have an issue of their own leaking, but it can be catastrophic to a building when there's a severe leak and you have a stack of 3 or 4 units down below. We have cases where buildings are where the mold condition has arisen because of leaking, and entire stacks have to be vacated, relocation, stripped out, and redone at great expense. Next slide. Windows are, of course, of great importance, and their ability to operate smoothly and properly impact people. It's one of the most appreciated improvements that residents that residents enjoy when there's a change and improvement in the windows. Next slide, please. Then, of course, waterproofing in general can create those same kinds of problems as roofs. Next. HVAC system, obviously comfort, and then, of course, our fire life safety systems. There are a number of other things that we went through, but these are just some samples of what we looked at. Next slide. So we focus on the key building elements that can potentially greatly impact the longevity of the building and the safety and the quality of life for the residents there. In short, site conditions, systems, fire and life safety, building envelope, which includes, of course, roof, windows, waterproofing, etc., and the interior general conditions. Next slide. So we looked at this in different ways. What was the level of the condition? How would you rate it as in a scale from 0 to 3? And again, and we'll show the different ratings, but the different areas that we looked at. What's the urgency of repair or replacement? It can be something that's slowly deteriorating, like a need for paint or other types of things that wear over time. Was there a safety impact that was involved? And then what's the cost impact? And we took, and it's different for every property, and it's different for different organizations, but we kind of broke the cost impact into 3 areas. The first one, under $5,000, what we considered a budgetable amount in an annual maintenance budget. 5 to 10, which means kind of pulling from reserves, and greater than 10, which could well mean the need to uh, to seek other funding or to draw from the organization's own funding, which, as Mark mentioned, is a significant drag on that organization. So let's look at those results. Next slide. And what we found, and you can see here that the red, we ordered this particular chart in the order of what we found to be the most severe. And not surprising, the roof and the HVAC systems, interior finishes, and the appearance in general was high. When you go down to something like uh, high across all of those elements, the number of occurrences, the condition, the urgency, the safety, the cost. And then we had two different basic types of measurements overall. What was the average across all of the properties? So take the rating and divide it by 20, because we looked at 20 properties. And then there were properties where certain things did not occur. Not every building has an elevator. So we looked at that for the occurrence, and you can see at the bottom of the list, there are certain items like, for example, plumbing, which plumbing and sometimes cleanliness and janitorial issues. It only occurred in 6 buildings, but when it did occur, it was severe. Again, elevators and lifts tended to be a problem up there, a little bit below the middle of our list here. Next slide. So this just kind of shows that method that we used when we talked about the conditions satisfactory to not functioning, the urgency, no urgency to immediate, the safety from satisfactory to an immediate hazard, the recommendation, nothing to be done or repair and replace or major repair, and then the costs from low to high. I explained what the average across the whole group that we looked at and the average per occurrence. Next slide. So as we said, roofs, HVAC systems, and interior finishes were the most severe. Elevators and waterproofing also rated highly, and they were where they existed was of great concern. And then next, the other items that were of concern and kind of popped out was the interior stairways, fencing, and handrails. So let's go look at that chart again, and maybe next slide, please. So maybe that gives you a bit more of the visual here. Some things were very high need, as we talked about. Some things were high need overall at the top there. Some things popped out as they were needed, but they occurred less frequently. Next slide. Just for illustration purposes, this is how it rated, looking at all of the 20 properties. And it kind of gives you a visual impression about how things occur. You can see some of the items, and the greens obviously are not the problems, and the reds are the highest level of problem. Sometimes just one of these items can have a cascading problem, as we spoke of before, of deterioration, whether it be elevators or it be security systems. Plumbing can, in itself, that too can cause a great deal of expense when mildew and a need to relocate occurs. Next slide, please. So what does this cost? And particularly as we look at the most recent uh, new buildings that are being built or major rehabs, this is largely a bargain. What we found was that on average, we had about $15,000 that needed to be spent on per unit. This is a per unit cost. So multiply that, of course, by the number of units in a building. Now, this is impacted by a number of different things. There was a small number of buildings that were in an extreme of almost $45,000, still a fraction of what new construction costs. And then there were some that were in better conditions that were closer to $2,000. So I think that this in part is what we need to be able to bring these buildings back and avoid the Skid Row Housing Trust phenomena. And for anybody who is not of the LA area, that was a collapse of a very important organization that was serving formerly homeless and people with special needs. And their portfolio just became too deteriorated to be able to sustain itself. Next slide. So the obvious thing is the need for more reserves. Without the money, you can't do it. It's not only the money; it's how it's used and it's planning that's really important. We looked at that and said, well, what's needed in these reserves? Well, this is our study is not precise. We need a number of. We need to look at 100 buildings to get to really precise or more precise numbers. But it became clear that there's a large need to have additional reserves, annual reserves going on. I was shocked to find out. I was talking to an organization that was looking at a fairly large scattered site, hundreds of units. And in the performa for resyndication, I couldn't believe that they were talking about reserves of $300 per unit per year. That was 20 years ago. And in many cases, in most cases it's increased, but it has not increased nearly enough. So we took with the assumption that all those things that were needed, that $15,000, if they were spread over and we took one by one, and if the needs and the cost of the needs were spread over the years since, next slide, the years since they were they were first started, they were put into place, they need not $5,000 per year, but an increase, 500, over $500 per unit per year. So really more realistic is something like $800 to $1,000 a year, rather than $300, $400, $500 a year. So the whole structure of these deals, so to speak, are somehow doomed to failure. And we're starting to see that happening. And if something isn't changed, we're going to have more Skid Row housing trusts. Next slide, please. So we looked at it from a number of different characteristics. And we looked at do they have rent subsidies, 50% or more subsidized? Was the construction new or was it rehab? Is it less than 30 years old or more than 30 years old? Is it more than, is it the size, the number of units? Of course, there's advantages in scale. And pretty much, I mean, these differences with the outliers, which were actually counterintuitive and could be attributed to other kinds of elements, were not terribly significant. The interesting thing is that new construction tended to have more costs involved, and that could be because of the infamous value engineering that took place, the size of the units, the size of the projects. So there were certain elements that really were counter to what we intuitively would have expected. But the one, next slide, please. But the one thing that we found was that there is not enough money being put into these projects. And without that, buildings will fail. And it doesn't matter large, small, subsidized, unsubsidized. I'm sure that if we had a larger study, we would find some level of impact from these different sectors of the group. One of the things that does tell us that new construction maybe needs to be better considered in terms of what ends up to be value engineered out. I think one of the things that I find is that we need across the board in most organizations a lot more dialogue between development and asset management. That's starting to happen more, but asset management can have a lot to say about what works, what doesn't work, what's going to lead to failure, and what isn't. So we've kind of identified seven pillars of what we call building health. And next slide. So the first one, as we've kind of talked about, is that in order to manage the process, you have to be constantly assessing and planning. And you need to, those plans cannot sit on a shelf someplace. They have to be used consistently, and this process needs to be constant and diligent. Next slide. So obviously we need more funding reserves. We need to procure them and be driving hard to wherever those sources can come from. We need to be pushing on those so that we don't lose foolishly, in terms of the big picture, foolishly lose valuable assets. We need to track and schedule the funding properly. And we also need to be able to justify holding on to reserves. Don't give up reserves without a fight. A lot of times we're called in to do an assessment so that it can be used to justify with an agency or a funder holding on reserves to things that are obviously needed. Next slide. So routine maintenance, of course, is of pivotal importance, and it must be a management priority. It can't just be a thought of doing routine maintenance and anything else. And it's difficult because immediate needs get in the way, and suddenly something that was scheduled for routine maintenance doesn't take place, and it's scheduled for a certain month. That month goes by and it gets undone, and nobody is tracking it or thinking about it. It can be something as simple as removing the leaves from roof gutters, because if those leaves are there and things back up again, you have, when it starts to rain, you have a moisture problem that can lead to a great deal of inconvenience and expense. Another thing that is really important is realize what the capability of your organization is in terms of maintenance. Often there's certain things that are always outsourced as a service contract, things like elevators, but there are other types of things like roofs and other boilers or HVAC, where it may seem like you don't have the budget to be able to have a service contract, but you certainly don't have the budget to have something fail unnecessarily. And particularly in this age with systems of energy conserving systems, you can have a big problem because of the intricacies of those systems. So moving on to the next slide. So deferred maintenance. Well, sometimes something is too big to be done on an immediate basis and it needs to be deferred for some time. But you need to then plan for it well. And when it is done, you need to inspect and document when it was done in case it needs to be done again at some future point as things, everything from painting to coating a parking lot needs to be done periodically. And deferred maintenance, ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It will only get worse and cause a further collapse and a further falling of these dominoes. Next, please. So then there's the major repairs that invariably take place, things like anything from a roof to a boiler replacement. And too often we find that something has been done because a friend or a relative or a brother-in-law or sister-in-law or somebody had a company and a resident manager knew that person and they got a bid and it gets done and no real procedures are followed. And so you need to have real procedures. Sometimes it pays. Certain types of things might even need an architect or an engineer or a construction manager, a project manager outsourced to follow something if it's particularly complex. Those things should always be done, not to add to expense, but to reduce expense. Because at the end of the day, when you can have a scope of work and documents and specifications, for one thing, you get apples to apples bids and you get taken seriously rather than the case where they look at a certain project as being done by somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. And it's very easy to be taken advantage of in those situations. Next slide, please. And again, mentioning from the previous one, the previous slide, things need to be inspected and documented. So as we look at building performance, if these things aren't done, building performance overall fails. And so the conditions of the property need to be monitored. Expenses need to be tracked. So you can be looking at how is this building performing? Are the people who are managing it doing a good job? Does it need more attention? And you cannot, there's an old saying that you cannot manage what you don't measure. So there needs to be metrics and ways in which you can look at building performance. There are programs that do that in different ways. Some people may be familiar with We Go Wise. That's one. Next. So at the end of the day, if you don't do all these things, the dominoes fall and the longevity has failed. And so we need to sustain the assets and we need to reduce life cycle costs. Next slide, please. So what do we need to keep the building and these different elements standing tall? That's assessments and planning, funded reserves, routine maintenance taken care of, deferred maintenance taken care of when needed, replacements and repairs and major repairs done in a timely manner. Building performance needs to be tracked, and at the end, you'll have longevity for your buildings. Next slide. So what is needed? We need to catch up. We need that funding to catch up. We need to build reserves. We need to make it so that when new buildings are built, that the making the deal pencil is not the only priority. Often asset management is handed an undoable task because they are the pro forma has not allowed for the resources that are needed. We can't just depend on resyndication. I think that resyndication, people were looking for resyndication, and for a number of years, it was a pretty reliable source, but it was almost counter to ongoing maintenance because people could say, well, we don't need to worry about it. We will resyndicate in a few years. And it made that more expensive and less cost effective. We need to build capacity within the organizations and have people who are trained to manage maintenance, manage caring for buildings. And overall, when we're talking about feeding more money into the system now, making the deals work better, making sure that we have trained people, making sure that that the annual reserves are there. We're really talking about, in many ways, systemic change, not just ending a webinar like this and hoping that someone is going to come along and contribute some money. We need that now, but we need to look at the system and how it's been working. And with that, I would love to answer any questions if there are.
Just before we do that, Ron, I just want to touch just quickly on those recommendations just a little bit, just to sort of expand on those a little bit.
Sure.
Can we go back a slide? So, and I think what Rod's alluded to and spoken to is the report really has three primary recommendations that we're sort of concluding with. And the first one just speaks to the fact that we do need additional funding pathways to invest in the immediate needs of these distressed properties. The study wasn't looking at why properties are in financial distress, but it was pretty obvious, right, Rob, when we looked at these owners and talked, looked at these projects, that the resources just aren't there within the project to stay current with what they need physically in terms of modernizing these buildings. And Rod really did a nice illustration of what that neglect, that spiral of funding neglect can do if we're not able to really resource the project sufficiently. So what we're asking policymakers and housing officials to do is when you have these capital tools, we've got to make sure we can adapt them or even create new funding tools with this specific purpose in mind. Even like a small step of creating like a small recap program just for owners to resolve these immediate physical needs. I mean, we talked through the per unit amounts, it's actually quite economical if you think about that investment. So we know there's tremendous impact in that. The second one is around rethinking how we underwrite these projects. There wasn't probably a more notable takeaway in the report or the study than knowing that owners just either the reserves are insufficient or they're non-existent to accommodate the types of improvements that we found. And no surprise, what Rod pointed out as the most highly rated, high needs building elements were the ones that are the most costly. You think about roofs and HVAC, so that's why those situations exist. And so what we're thinking is industry standards really relative to reserve deposit requirements have to be adjusted to be more adequate and realistic. And so we've estimated 500 per unit per year. That's more than double the current norm. So this is part of a bigger theme that I think we're seeing in the course of the preservation work that we do, which is to operate PSH is more costly, right? It's a more costly model, understandably. And so we have to treat that a little bit more uniquely and not sort of more, uniformly when we think about, regulations and requirements with respect to affordable housing. These are going to need to be treated a little bit differently. So I think this was very evident in the research, just the fact that these properties are more costly to operate, and therefore we need to have more sufficient reserves to be able to really address these needs over the long term. And then I thought, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention the $500 is it may not be clear here. That is the increase that we need from
Yes,
current, not the total. We found that we needed $500 per unit more than currently exists because we could see the deficit in the condition of the buildings.
that's right. And I think, we didn't go into each deal and look at their specific reserve requirements, but we've looked at this enough to know that some of these old deals, the reserve deposit requirements were like $150 per unit per year for these old like CRA deals, for those of you in California. So that there's just no way these properties are going to be able to endure. And then the third one I appreciate, because Rob is really quick to point this out, which is, providing attention to physical needs isn't just a financial issue or constraint. There is a capacity building aspect to this. When we think about reinvesting in actual organizations, this is very technical work that's very complicated. And I think we have to commit ourselves as a field to really investing training and tools and resources and so on and so forth to really support frontline staff that are doing building maintenance as well as asset management. Because portfolio management is a long-term investment. And we think it should become, standard practice even to do like a capital needs assessment every 5 years, even if that's not required. So things like that. So you'll see more attention on that in the report. But that is where we've sort of left off. So I think in terms of next steps, we are currently wrapping up the report as we speak. It's kind of in a layout and design phase right now. So it's a matter of weeks from being released. Obviously, everybody on this call will be sent the study, and we'll certainly do a bigger distribution of that as well. We're quite excited about that, to get that out, get that research out, and it'll feature a lot of what you saw today. And then we're also doing our biannual risk assessment on the broader 50 plus properties as well. So that's going to be coming out probably in a couple months. So stay tuned for that. That'll go out through our listservs and mailing lists as well. Not going to go as deep on the physical side of it, but we still want to be able to offer a little bit of a risk profile as we track these properties over time. So we're looking forward to that. As we mentioned, this will be recorded. So obviously everybody that signed up, we'll make sure that you get this recording and the slides. So don't worry about that. We encourage you to promote that as well. And I think that concludes the main part of the presentation. We just want to leave some time for questions and answers. And so I see two that have come in through the Q&A feature, but feel free to keep sending those over. So the first one, Rod, is what can be done to ensure adequate reserves to address maintenance? How can private funders help to address this problem of distressed properties? And I feel like we've spoken to that a little bit, right? Yeah, I mean.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think the first step is really demonstrating the need, and unfortunately, we have a poster child for what happens when that doesn't take place. My expertise is not on the financial side, it's on the needs side. And so, Mark, maybe you can address some of that about what kinds of sources can be tapped to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think for obviously public lenders out there that have loans on these deals, we've seen owners want to go back and restructure, kind of modify those agreements to try to bring them up to a little bit more modern standards. And so that's an opportunity if that's happening. And that could also include a sort of affordability extension as well, if the covenant's coming up, to be able to like really adjust those per unit amounts to get them up to more modern standards. And I think just moving forward as an underwriting consideration, we would love to see the industry adopt a higher standard. I mean, we just feel like there's just no way, even for new deals now, that you could expect the longevity for 50 plus years of use and affordability without sort of a higher reserve level. So that's, obviously per unit amounts, capitalizing that, and funders, to the extent that we can invest in a shorter term strategy to create a small program to actually replenish reserves. And I know, like, folks like the city of LA are even considering something like that as we speak. That is really important. So I think that's how you can help out.
I think there's
Joanne,
another
yeah,
factor.
yep.
I think there's another factor here that, unlike market rate housing or other kinds of real estate, that only at certain milestones will they consider a major effort to look at the entire, or not to look at, but to rehab or repair the entire building. The process is ongoing. You shouldn't have to wait 15 years to replace a boiler, because boilers often fail before that. The whole concept of this 15-year division of in the process also often leads to waste, where in some cases there are systems that have another 5 years of useful life, but because it's a one-shot deal, they end up getting disposed of prematurely and waste resources being replaced when they don't need to be, because we keep having to look at a 15-year window. So when we're talking about $500 additional, we're talking under the existing system. There needs to be opportunities within that 15 years, or a constant level of annual reserves that take care of keeping a building in good condition, whether it needs it at year 8, 10, 12, or 14, and to be able to put substantial investments into the longevity of the building.
Yep. So I see a couple of questions in the chat too, even though I know we want to focus on the Q&A. We're going to take a couple of these. There's a couple of related ones around reserves. Definitely seeing a theme there. One from Walter is, should there be different standard reserve requirements for mixed income buildings based on the percentage or size of PSH? And then kind of a related one from Dora, should the reserve requirements be different for new construction or ACK rehab? Any thoughts on how we could differentiate some of the reserve sizing or deposit requirements based on the property kind of characteristics? Any thoughts on that?
Well, let me take the second question first.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
it's the one that I know. Having been involved as a construction manager in both new construction and ACK rehabs, an ACK rehab can be as effective in creating a theoretically new building as new construction, and sometimes more so, because the resources can be spent in different ways rather than creating the structure itself. There's inefficiencies in rehabilitation, but there's also the advantage of having the structure there. In some, it varies greatly. In some cases, the structure can be an impediment depending on the type, et cetera, without getting into the weeds there. But I would say that it is not determinate, and we saw this in our research and our comparison. It is not determined about whether it's an ACK rehab or new construction. And new construction standards, though there are a lot of specific items, particularly related to energy, but often, and I come out and look at something, and something like the traffic coding or the waterproofing, and they say, yeah, well, it was going to be different, but we value engineered that. And often people are forced or inclined to quote value engineer out items that are of a critical nature to the longevity and the maintenance of the building. I'm sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Well, just like if it's a percentage of PSH, it's not all PSH in the building, you know, would you size things differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bump when you have PSH. It is we definitely see that there is more wear on PSH buildings, but maybe that could be compensated for by one of the things that we talked a lot about, which is ongoing assessments, making sure things don't deteriorate, I don't think it can be eliminated, but it could possibly be mitigated by tracking conditions more carefully, particularly in PSH units or buildings.
Yep. Okay. Want to take another question from Jillian. I think this is for you, Rod. Have you seen cost savings from region-wide maintenance contracts for certain trades like plumbing, electric, HVAC, security?
I've thought about that, and I've seen some attempts at it. It's difficult to do. What I have seen is the opposite being very costly, which is when things are done completely one-off on a spontaneous basis. Yes, I think there were definitely, you can get bigger players, more professional contractors and trade or subcontractors. I also think that looking at your own portfolio and looking and getting assessments across your portfolio and buying windows for 7 buildings or 10 buildings or 5 buildings can create savings within your own organization. Roofing, other things like that. Once again, it also makes it more practical to be able to get somebody to write a real specification and create a real scope of work that can be used across a number of buildings. I would love to see it where people within a region organize, and I would, if anybody wants some assistance in what I think could be helpful in the specifics, I'd be glad to be a part of it. But can organize to buy together and create standards and contracts and specification and scopes together and buy together.
Yep. I'm going to tackle a question from Brian. It's both kind of an observation experience that he's sharing, but also a question. So sounds like it may not be in California, but an issue we face on the development side is pressure and requirements on construction cost containment from public sector funders, which invariably leads to trade-offs, right? We've been trying to argue that PSH and cost containment are incompatible policy objectives, but it's a hard message to push. Any thoughts on making the case for better setting PSH properties up for success with enough resources from the start from the public sector?
Theodore Housing Trust.
That is the example. Yeah.
That's the result of what happens. And I did construction management on some of their buildings 2 or 3 decades to a couple of decades ago, and sometimes the construction was underfunded, sometimes it wasn't, but I think the biggest problem was the performa in terms of reserves was underfunded. And I think that success would probably mean a mindset that says this is not a 15-year building. You know, this is a 30 or 50-year-old building. So how do we build it that way so that the life cycle costing, and that's probably what I would say would be the best argument. What is the life cycle cost of doing it one way or another way? What is the life cycle cost of investing a little bit more now so that you maintain these assets year after year? So I think it's a question of advocacy, of demonstrating the effectiveness of doing it right and the ineffectiveness of doing it wrong.
Yep. Question from Amy. Have you noticed any patterns that relate back to organizational leadership or structure? Meaning, are some owners doing better than others across the board?
Yes.
Not that we examine that specifically right in
I
this
think
study.
yes.
Yeah.
I think the difference is, and as I alluded to this earlier, is the improvements in not siloing development, asset management, and property management. That the integration of those is probably most key. Many years ago, back, LISC used to give courses. There were 9 6-hour courses, and I was asked to teach a couple of times. And what I found, they asked me to do it on the maintenance side, and at that time I was more a construction manager, and I said I'm not a maintenance guy, I'm a construction manager. They said, but you understand building. So I ended up learning a lot at the time. But what I found is that the people who were sent to that course really felt as though they were never listened to, that they had a lot to share, but no one was interested in hearing them. Now, this is a long time ago, but I would, and as I said, it's improved. But I think that's what's really important. And I think it's incumbent that asset management be at the table. And I know that some organizations do that. So that would be the answer. I think when asset management is well-staffed and professional, and the development staff likewise, and that they sit at the table together, I think that's how you can get the best outcome.
Yeah, I like that. Jillian wants to know, is there any indication that underwriters and funders are planning to adjust their standards? And I think I could take that, Rod, to say that is exactly the target of this research, is to be able to advocate to funders to say, hey, this is what we've observed. This is where we need to adapt and adjust. I don't think that that is necessarily going to be an intrinsic, change in their sort of, regulatory policy without, I think, some evidence to back it up. And I stand corrected for those funders that may be on the call that are really being more, thoughtful and progressive about that. But I don't see that inevitably changing without some advocacy. What do you think, Rod?
I think that's very true, and I think it's difficult because whether it be the electeds or the agency heads or the development uh, staff, everybody, the glory is in building that new building or doing that that complete rehab and cutting the ribbon. The glory is not in this side of work in general, but this is what really matters. This is what really makes it effective. This is what takes a building that fails after a relatively short time, rather than that 30 to 50 plus lifespan. This is what provides housing for people that are all the things that we want, safe, clean and secure housing. So the glory is in year one. And I think that's part of the problem. And I think that we have a lot to do to educate, to say that we need to be looking at the problem. We need to be looking at not having people return to the street or not be able to get off the street because we have housing that wasn't taken care of.
All right, I'm going to leave. We're at time. I'm going to leave with one final question. It's from Joanne. Appreciate you, Joanne. I see you. You're in the chat here. $1 million question. Where's the funding going to come from?
I'm going to leave that to you, Mark.
Yeah, that's our job, Joanne. And that's the job of our advocacy community, is to be able to really make the case for why this level of important immediate investments in the physical conditions of these buildings is indispensable in our bigger investments around homelessness. It's not a peripheral thing. This is not something that can wait 20 years. We have to do this now. I know we're working on bigger policy work around the overall recapitalization environment to do resyndications and recaps and all that bigger stuff. But this is stuff we pointed to with Rod's analysis. We can do this right now. This is stuff that's achievable. So where the resources are going to come from, it's probably going to be a mixture of private and public resources. But we need the upswell and the political leadership to get it done. So I think we're going to leave it on that note. I want to thank Rod. I want to thank Christina, the entire team at Enterprise for being able to pull this off. Stay tuned. I've got my contact information here if you want to reach me. We're very much looking forward to getting the report out to you. But in the immediate term, we're going to get these slides out and the recording out to all of you that registered. So stay tuned for that. And we really hope you learned something today and got something out of it. We really appreciate your participation. So thanks so much. And we'll see you next time.